This video is sponsored by Incogni. This right over here is Denmark, and this here is Greenland, the autonomous region that still belongs to the Danish kingdom. And right over here, you've got Iceland, a country of around 400,000 people that's actually closer to Greenland than any other European country. And as you all know, Trump really wants Greenland. And it's really not just talk anymore. He's pressured European countries with tariff threats unless they back the US claim over Greenland. And in a very recent speech, he even mentioned Iceland.
A piece of ice, cold and poorly located. Iceland, that I can tell you. I mean, our stock market took the first dip yesterday because of Iceland. So Iceland's already cost us a lot of money. I'm helping NATO, and I've until the last few days when I told them about Iceland, they loved me.
Okay, right, he probably just got confused here, mixing up Greenland and Iceland. But still though, the message is loud and clear, and it's sending shockwaves across the entire region, including straight into Reykjavik. Because here's the thing, Trump keeps arguing that the US needs a stronger presence in the Arctic to counter China and Russia. And sure, that applies to Greenland. But it applies just as much to Iceland, because both countries sit in the same strategic corridor in the North Atlantic, a region that's suddenly becoming way more important, both militarily and economically, as the ice caps melt and new routes open up. And all of this is raising some very real questions in Iceland, because Iceland is the only NATO member without a standing army. Instead, it relies on NATO as a whole, and on a separate defense agreement with the United States that dates back to 1951. And it's not just about security in the narrow military sense, it's about something bigger. Reykjavik is starting to wonder how reliable Washington really is, not just as a security partner, but even as an economic one. Especially now, when the US looks less committed to international agreements and more willing to treat alliances like a bargaining chip. For example, in August 2025, Trump introduced a 15% tariff on Icelandic goods. So, as security concerns rise, and that dependence on the US comes under more scrutiny, EU membership is being discussed more and more in Reykjavik. Not only as an economic choice, but as a long-term defense choice, a geopolitical choice. But before we get into Iceland's potential journey right here into the EU, a quick word from our sponsor. A few months ago, I got a call from a random German number. It looked legit. The guy claimed to be an Amazon representative, asking whether I wanted to extend or cancel my Prime subscription. My brain was super deep in the middle of writing a YouTube script, and I really wasn't thinking. He sounded super professional and said all I had to do was download a service app from the Play Store. So yeah, I actually searched it and found one. But thank God, just before hitting the install button, my brain finally switched back on, screaming scam. I cancelled the call, and after a bit of Googling, it turns out the app would have helped to compromise everything on my phone, including my banking details. And yeah, this really wasn't a one-off. Scam calls, phishing emails, sketchy links, they keep coming. Because our personal data is out there. And for a long time, there was literally nothing you could do about it. Until now. Check out Incogni, a service that fights to get your personal information removed from data brokers. These companies are legally required to delete your data if you ask them to. But doing all of that manually, that's a full-time job. So Incogni does it all for you, automatically. They contact the brokers, request removals, and even handle objections, all on your behalf. So, if you want to take back control of your own data, click the link below or go to incogni.com/EUMadeSimple to sign up for an exclusive 60% off an annual plan. And it's completely risk-free, with a 30-day money-back guarantee. Back to the video. Now, the idea of Iceland joining the European Union really isn't new. Back in 2009, right in the middle of the financial crisis, Iceland's pro-EU Social Democratic Alliance actually applied for EU membership. But that process really did not last, because in 2015, the bid was officially withdrawn after power shifted to two more Eurosceptic parties, the Independence Party and the Progressive Party. And Iceland stepping back from the EU really came down to 3 big issues. First, fish. Fish isn't just an industry in Iceland, it's basically part of its national identity. And a lot of Icelanders are worried that EU membership would mean giving up control over their fishing waters because of the EU's common fisheries policy. Second, sovereignty. There is a real fear that joining the EU would mean handing too much power to Brussels over rules, regulation, and national decision-making. And third, money. Iceland kept its own currency, the Icelandic krona, and many people did not want to give that up by having to adopt the euro, especially after the chaotic financial crisis the years before. But even though Iceland isn't in the EU, it's very deeply integrated into the European system. For example, Iceland is part of the European Economic Area, the EEA. That basically means Iceland has access to the EU's single market, so goods, services, capital, and people can move much more freely between Iceland and the EU countries. And Iceland is also part of the Schengen Agreement, which means there are no routine border checks when traveling between Iceland and most of continental Europe. Now, for the last 10 years, that arrangement was pretty comfortable. Iceland got many of the benefits of being close to the EU without actually joining it. But the world is changing, and under Trump, the rules of the game are starting to look a lot more unpredictable. So suddenly, EU membership comes with some very concrete advantages. There are the obvious ones. Iceland will get a seat at the table, voting rights, access to more EU funding programs, and a stronger position for Icelandic businesses operating across Europe. But the 2 big ones right now are trade and security. On trade, EU membership would mean stronger protection against pressure from outside powers, because Iceland would be part of the EU's common trade policy, backed by the EU's weight in disputes. And then, of course, there's security. Because if Iceland joined the EU, it would also fall under the EU's Mutual Defence Clause, Article 42.7. That clause says that if an EU country is the victim of armed aggression, the other member states have an obligation to provide aid and assistance. And politically, Iceland is getting pretty close to a majority in favor of EU membership too. This right here is the current government. The current government is a 3-party coalition. First, you have the Social Democratic Alliance. They lead the government, and the Prime Minister has been super clear. Getting Iceland closer to the EU is a major goal. Then there's Viðreisn. I probably pronounced that completely wrong, but they're a pro-EU centrist party that surged in the polls. And finally, the People's Party. They're more soft Eurosceptic, but crucially, they've agreed not to block a referendum from happening. Now, on the opposition side, you've got 3 parties that are firmly against joining. But with a government that's now broadly pro-EU and around 60% of Icelanders supporting a referendum on membership, the debate isn't really, is this possible anymore? It's starting to look more like, when does Iceland actually put it to a vote? And that's why Iceland's foreign minister recently announced that the parliament will present a resolution this spring on whether to hold a referendum on resuming EU accession talks. And if parliament approves that resolution, Icelanders could head to the polls within 9 months, meaning the government may be aiming for a vote by spring 2027. And all the numbers are already pointing in that direction. One Gallup survey found 44% supporting accession and 36% opposing it. And what's really interesting is when you break this down by political party, because the pro-EU vote is starting to spread beyond just the usual suspects. And if the political turmoil in the world keeps going in this direction, there's a very real chance Iceland could end up voting yes. And honestly, if Icelanders vote yes, EU membership could become a reality in just a few years. They might even end up as the 28th European member state, if all the other candidates keep getting delayed. This is what I think. I personally would love Iceland to join the EU. Because the way I see it, there's 3 spheres of influence forming across the world. You have the US, you have China, potentially together with Russia, and you have the EU, or Europe. And we need to make sure that our neighbors, not just Iceland by the way, come into our sphere of influence and join us in our values that we represent across the world. And this goes for all candidate numbers. We have Ukraine, Moldova, the Western Balkan states, and yes, also Turkey. I know a lot of the watchers here do not like seeing Turkey join the EU, and I am not advocating for that either. But to get them involved in either the single market or a better customs union would be very beneficial for us. We need to keep all of these countries in our sphere of influence. And now is the perfect time to do it, because Trump is basically alienating all of the countries in the world, especially his allies. So getting them closer to us is a win. Now, let's have a look again at Iceland. Their main concerns are fish, sovereignty, and the euro. To be honest, the sovereignty argument is getting less and less strong because in this world with all of these global superpowers, to keep your sovereignty is only possible if you ally yourself to one of the strong superpowers in the world. In this case, the EU. But when we look at fish, I think the EU needs to be flexible here, especially because fisheries is such a big part of Iceland's economy. And having them join, as I mentioned, our sphere of influence is definitely the priority here. So, Iceland, I hope you go for a referendum and I hope you decide to join us. And if this is the case, of course, I'll make more and more videos about this topic in the future. Thank you so much for watching. And thank you so much to our presidents, Ava Europa, Kristen and Peter, Clement, Daniel, Dev3ZK, Eupedia, Giuseppe, HVDJ, Kiki Luxen, Masiex, Mikael, Rashid, Shauki and Jan, Stefan, Unite Europe, and Westervang. See you in the next video.